Today, as you know, is the 104th anniversary of general theory of relativity. Einstein gave his final form of general theory of relativity on 25th November 1915, and today is its anniversary. Because he was familiar with what happened in electromagnetism, and since his theory was a relativistic theory of gravity, he immediately realized in the next year that there must be gravitational waves predicted by his theory. So he predicted in 1916 as an important consequence of general relativity using a simple version of his theory which we call linearized gravity. And in 1918, he gave what we call today as the quadrupole formula, which is analogous to the dipole formula which we have in electromagnetism, which basically says that the gravitational wave perturbation falls off as 1 by r. It is given by these fundamental constants, and it is given by the second time derivative of the quadrupole moment. Remember, the dipole formula has the first time derivative of the dipole moment. So if you take this simple formula and apply it to a system which moves with velocity v and has a mass m, then this simple formula reduces to this following combination, where m is the mass, v is the velocity, and r is the distance from the source. And then if you apply it to a simple numerical problem where you have two trucks separated by a couple of meters rotating at about a kilohertz, then the value of h comes out to be 10 raised to minus 39. And remember, Einstein worked in the patent office, and therefore he realized that this must have practically vanishing value in all conceivable situations. Such ripples would be vanishingly small and nearly impossible to detect. And of course, he was right, because it took 100 years to make the first detection of gravitational waves. What happened over the next 50 years? Over the next 50 years, there was essentially a babble around this whole idea of gravitational waves. For example, immediately in 1922, Eddington pointed out that though Einstein derived his formula, it does not apply for self-gravitating systems. And also that if you analyze the equations, it looked like gravity waves could propagate at any speed you can imagine. 1936, Einstein added to the confusion when he wrote to one of his friends, together with a young collaborator, I arrived at the interesting result that gravitational waves do not exist. But by the time the paper was finally published, since that he was making some erroneous interpretation of the analysis, and by the time the paper was published, he retracted this particular claim. The basic question was, do gravitational waves actually transfer energy like electromagnetic waves, or they are an illusion because we are choosing coordinates which are wavy? This is really the physical question which you have to answer. And people like Feynman, for example, in 1957, was very frustrated by all the mathematical discussions which were happening in relativity. And he said, supposed to have said, drive on, make up your mind, don't be so rigorous or you will not succeed. He then goes to another relativity meeting in 1961 and finds that the physicists, relativists are still discussing about gravitational waves. And then he writes to his wife and says, a day to discuss, do gravitational waves carry energy? It's not good for my blood pressure. So you can see here that for almost 50 years, the actual status of gravitational waves was not very clear. And it took almost 40 to 50 years to set up a conceptual framework so that you could say without ambiguity that gravitational waves exist in general relativity and what are the properties of gravitational waves. It almost took 50 years. And if you ask what are the technical complications, it was really related to the fact that people were confused about whether singularities are coordinate singularities or whether they are physical singularities. What kind of boundary conditions you have to use to discuss radiation? If you use an approximation scheme, how do you impose boundary conditions in that approximation scheme? All these technical complications made the analysis very, very difficult, and it was sort of realized that if you have self-gravitating bodies, you have a technical complication because the potential is of the same order as velocity by the virial theorem. So if you want to calculate higher order corrections, that is v square by c square corrections, you have to deal with the nonlinearities of Einstein's equation. You cannot deal with the linear version of Einstein's equations. And as you know, dealing with nonlinearities is not a simple exercise. So therefore, there were many different approaches, one due to Einstein, Infeld and Hoffman, another by Landau, Lifshitz, and another by Fock. And these are the prototypes by which we do the analysis even today. In 1960s, there was an important result when Chandrasekhar attacked this problem by following work which was done earlier by Trautmann. The question he wanted to answer was, how does the emission of gravitational wave affect an emitting system when it is self-gravitating? And then, by analysis of the equations, he could show that the energy and angular momentum, which are radiated as gravitational waves, they are correctly balanced by the loss of mechanical energy and angular momentum from the system. And this gave astrophysicists confidence that GR was physically reasonable and well behaved. So you can see here that 50 years after Einstein predicted this, you come to a situation where you believe in the physicality of the gravitational wave. A very important historical event was the Chapel Hill meeting in 1957, where Pirani, who was a postdoc with Bondi, essentially made the point that if you look at the tidal effect of gravitational waves, they are unambiguously given by the theory. And therefore, if you look at the geodesic deviation equation, then there's no doubt about whether gravitational waves are passing through a region of space or not. And immediately in that meeting, when there were discussions with Bondi, the physicality of gravitational waves was sort of resolved. They basically argued that if you had a kind of rod on which you put some washers, which could be sort of moved, if gravitational waves fell on it, they would be tidally moving, and that friction will heat. So you are converting gravitational waves into heat. So that really means that gravitational wave is a physical quantity. And immediately, once the physicality was understood, we can say that the quest of gravitational wave detection was born, because in this meeting, Joe Weber and John Wheeler were there. So after going back from this meeting, Joe Weber built his first detector of gravitational waves, which was a bar. And in a sense, even though there was a lot of confusion before, the first experimental search for gravitational waves really began. In parallel, the discussion of gravitational waves in the full general theory of relativity was sort of finalized by Bondi and his collaborators. So we moved from the babble around gravitational waves to actual search for gravitational waves. And as I said, the first search for gravitational waves happened by Joe Weber, who built a bar detector in 1960. But then, in 1969, he made the claim that gravitational waves have been detected by his detector. But when other people tried to reproduce his experiment, they found that his results could not be reproduced. So in a sense, we consider him as a kind of tragic pioneer, and it almost took 50 years before the instrument which could make the detection for gravitational waves was built. And in the meanwhile, the following changes had to happen. Instead of bar detectors, we had to use laser interferometers, which are more sensitive instruments. Bar detectors are sensitive in a small region of frequency, so we call them narrowband detectors, whereas the laser interferometers are broadband detectors. And the sources which we were looking for were supernova. And as I will argue now in the next few slides, the sources which are our favorite prototypes are coalescing compact binaries made up of neutron stars and black holes. So in the 50 years since he built his first detectors, many of these changes were possible, and this is what really allowed for the detection of gravitational waves. Now, before moving ahead, let us ask the following question. If you analyze the equations of general relativity as you analyze electromagnetic equations, you can talk about the properties of gravitational waves. And the properties are the following. They travel at the speed of light, they are transverse, and they have two states of polarization. So you can see here that is exactly like what happens in electromagnetism. Just as electromagnetic waves carry away energy, angular momentum, and linear momentum, gravitational waves also carry away all these quantities. Just as accelerated charges create electromagnetic waves, accelerated masses create gravitational waves. And there are differences. Those were similarities. Similarities are because of the fact that the gravitational interaction is about 10 raised to 39 times weaker compared to electromagnetism. So, gravitational waves will propagate unperturbed through space as they interact weakly with matter. This allows you to do the following. You can observe gravitational waves even if they are emitted inside a supernova, even if they are coming from the first events of the Big Bang, because you can see photons from, let's say, 100,000 years after the Big Bang, neutrinos around 1 second after the Big Bang. But you can see gravitational waves from 10 raised to minus 43 seconds after the Big Bang if gravitational waves are emitted there. So you can see here that what gravitational waves tell you is an undisturbed picture of the universe. Unlike electromagnetism, gravitational interaction is non-linear because of the fact that the wave energy itself will have a gravitational field. So technical calculations in gravitational waves becomes much more complicated, but the important point is that these properties of gravitational waves which I am talking about come from general theory of relativity. If your theory of gravity is different, the properties of gravitational waves will be different, and therefore eventually by using gravitational waves, you will be able to test Einstein's general theory of relativity. As I told you, many things happened in between, and one of them was the discovery of pulsar. In 1933, Bade and Zwicky said that at the end of stellar evolution, neutron stars should be sort of formed as end states of supernova explosion. But nobody knew how to look for neutron stars. Now, what are neutron stars? Neutron stars are stars as massive as the sun, but of radius 10 to 15 kilometers. So if you put these two numbers together, you will see that they are at nuclear densities. So neutron stars are like giant nuclei. But how do you look for them? Now in 1967, while looking for radio sources by scintillation, Jocelyn Bell, who was a graduate student like you, and Tony Hewish, who was our advisor, were trying to study something else when they found a source which was very, rotating with very precise period. So when they tried to interpret this particular source, they essentially realized that these are nothing, they cannot be anything else but rotating neutron stars. And that is what we call as pulsars. Now, the important point is for the discovery of pulsars, the Nobel Prize was given to Hewish and Ryle. It was not given to Jocelyn Bell because she was a graduate student, but we are all very happy that in 2018, she was given the Breakthrough Prize for discovering pulsars. I also would like to emphasize that these are areas where a graduate student can make breakthrough discoveries, as you'll see in the next slide. Once pulsars were discovered, radio astronomers started looking for more and more kinds of pulsars. And in 1974, another graduate student, Hulse, who was working with Taylor, was trying to look for more pulsars. And at that particular point, they came up with a pulsar which was slightly more unusual. This pulsar was unusual because by using pulsar timing, you could reconstruct the orbit in which this object was sort of moving. And this is by using radio observations. And then you suddenly realize that you have in the heavens a kind of dumbbell. And if you believe general theory of relativity, this system should emit gravitational waves. And instead of moving on a fixed orbit, it should spiral inwards. And you should see a signature of that in spiral in the gravitation, in the measurements which you are making. And this exactly is what Weisberg and Taylor basically did. They looked for this system for about 4 to 8 years. And at the end of 8 years, they could say that what the observations were really matching with what Einstein's theory predicted and not with what Newton would have said. So in 1993, for this system, and as you can see here, this system has been observed for almost 30 to 40 years, and all the points which are dots here are observations, and the thick line is the prediction coming from Einstein's general theory of relativity. So you have radio observations, which is an indirect observation, which tells you that binary systems lose energy by gravitational wave emission. For the discovery of this particular object, these two gentlemen, Hulse and Taylor, were given the Nobel Prize in 1993 because by using them, you could study general theory of relativity even more accurately. Are there other pulsars which have been discovered? Yes, later on, many other binary pulsars have been discovered, and every time you try to make this kind of plot, you match with what Einstein predicted. Now you are in a situation, remember, for 50 years people didn't believe in the gravitational waves. When the maths became so exact, people started asking the question, why is this formula working at all? Because this formula was derived by using linearized gravity. Now we are talking about two neutron stars which are strongly gravitating and going around each other. So why is it that a formula discovered in an approximation matches so well in a situation where the system is very relativistic and very strongly gravitating? So there was a controversy when this system was discovered, and in the theoretical work of people like Damour, Walker, and many others, one could understand that there was a fundamental reason why the linearized gravity results should match even when this system is strongly gravitating. It is basically because of what is called as the effacing principle which happens, which in some sense effaces the external information on all the neutron stars. Whether it's a neutron star or an ordinary star, it does not really matter. What really matters is the mass of that particular object, and the quadrupole formula applies even for strongly gravitating bodies. So now you are in a situation where you can put together two very different things. We have a quadrupole formula for Einstein, and we have a binary neutron star system which is sort of inspiraling inwards. So you can ask the question, what will happen to this particular system when you wait for a long time? Let's say you wait for about 300 million years. So remember, these two objects are very far. Because it's inspiraling, it's coming closer and closer. And finally, after 300 million years, they will sort of hit each other. Why is it possible? Remember, if it is an ordinary star has a radius of about 10,000 kilometers. So it will not be able to come very, very close. But a neutron star is almost like a point. It's only about 10 kilometers. So it can come very, very close. And therefore, the frequency at which you can see this particular neutron star binary has a very special role in what you will see next. So immediately by putting these two together, we can say that in the universe, there exist inspiraling neutron stars which will emit gravitational waves for hundreds of million years before they coalesce spectacularly. And when they coalesce, at what frequency do they coalesce? So one can show that the late inspiral of these binary neutron stars happens exactly in the bandwidth where you can build the sensitive detectors. You can build sensitive laser interferometric detectors in the frequency range of about 10 hertz to about a kilohertz. And when it's about to coalesce, the frequency of these systems is roughly of that same order of magnitude. So you can see here that many things had to come together. First, you have to have such a system, you have to have a detector, and you have to have a detector which is sensitive exactly in those frequency ranges. And as I have been sort of saying, there are other binary pulsar-like systems which have been seen. If this coalesces in about 300 million years, other binary pulsars will coalesce in about 80 million years, and one of them in even about 46 million years. Now keep in mind that though it looks like a very large amount of time, millions of years, the age of the universe is in billions of years. So compared to the age of the universe, this is very, very small. So in the universe, even though this binary pulsar is not coalescing, maybe there are other binary pulsars which are currently coalescing. And that is exactly the kind of sources we are looking for. So you have to ask the question, what kind of tidal force fields are created in general theory of relativity? And then when you do the analysis of Einstein's equations, you will see that the tidal forces act along a plus direction or along a 45-degree turned direction, which I call the cross direction. So the force acts like this. So if this force acts on a ring of particles, the ring of particles will be squeezed and elongated with this time-dependent profile, which is shown here. So if you want to detect gravitational waves, you should be able to measure the small squeeze which is happening here. I am exaggerated in this diagram, of course, the squeeze. So the important point is that find out how much squeeze is happening. If you can measure that squeeze, you can measure the presence of a gravitational wave. So to quantify it, you define the notion of what we call as a gravitational wave strain. If you have two bodies which are separated by a distance L, and because of the action of gravitational waves, if they are squeezed and elongated by an amount delta L, just take the ratio of delta L by L. This is a dimensionless quantity, so we call it the dimensionless strain. So if your H is fixed, if you want to have a large delta L, you should obviously have a large L. So that is the reason we really want to build as big an instrument as sort of possible. You cannot do this measurement by building an interferometer in the laboratory. You need to build large-scale interferometers, and that is exactly what we do. So what we do is, now we ask the question, I know there is a binary neutron star system, I know its mass, I know, let me sort of put it in the nearest cluster of galaxies, which is the Virgo cluster of galaxies. And then you ask, what is the strain it will create in a detector if I have it on the Earth? Then you find that the strain it causes is not 10 raised to minus 39. You remember, I gave you a number which Einstein talked about, that if you have a laboratory source the strain it causes is 10 raised to minus 39. If you have an astrophysical source in the nearest cluster of galaxies, then the strain it causes is 10 raised to minus 21. So if you can build an interferometer which is a kilometer long, then the displacement you are needing to measure is 10 raised to minus 18th of a meter, which is smaller than the nuclear dimension. So in something which is a kilometer long, you want to measure something smaller than a nuclear dimension. And that exactly is the reason why you basically have to wait for so long, because if you compare with what you measure when you do the Michelson-Morley experiment, you find that what you are measuring is about 10 raised to minus 9th of a meter. So in 1905, when we were talking about the Michelson-Morley experiment, this was the displacement you could measure. But what we need to measure to detect gravitational waves is 10 raised to minus 18. Almost 10 orders of magnitude. So if you assume that technology improves by a factor of 10, it would take about 100 years, and that's exactly what happened. So the important point you have to sort of keep in mind is that the laser interferometers we have sort of built is the way in which we want to detect gravitational waves. And the person who basically began thinking about it to use laser interferometry was Ray Weiss. In a paper which he wrote in an obscure journal of MIT, he basically tried to use the idea of a laser interferometer to measure small displacement. Now, the important point you have to keep in mind is you may have a very sensitive instrument, but that instrument, if it is subject to many other sources of noise, you would not be able to make this very small measurement. So what you really have to make sure is list all possible sources of noise which will cause displacement much more than this particular gravitational wave signal. So he did this first detailed noise sensitivity analysis, and he realized that the interferometer is subject to shot noise, radiation pressure noise, thermal noise, seismic noise, gravity gradient noise, etc. And he made an estimate by using standard physics of what will be the value of displacement which these different noises will cause. And then from this, there was a small proposal developed which is called the Blue Book. And finally, in 1989, the whole thing got converted into a proposal to the NSF for creating the LIGO detector. Now, how do you gain that extra 10 factors in going from the Michelson-Morley experiment to this? A simple Michelson-Morley experiment, if you build, even if it's a kilometer long, it is not sensitive enough. So what you try to do is use all the tricks which you know. And one of them is to use the fact that if you can increase the optical path length by using Fabry-Perot cavities, then essentially you are increasing the length of the interferometer. So you create a Fabry-Perot cavity in which you bounce light 100 times. So even if you have a 1 kilometer long interferometer, it's like having a 100 kilometer long interferometer because you're storing the light for that particular amount of time. Then there are techniques to improve the sensitivity at high frequencies which are called power recycling. So you do power recycling about 50 times. Then there are techniques which are called signal recycling. And of course, you build specialized photodetectors. And putting all these things together, you can measure not just the displacement between two fringes, but you can split the fringe and measure 10 raised to minus 11th of a fringe. So this is what really allowed you to go beyond the standard interferometer. So we can say that the interferometer acts like a transducer. It's converting the gravitational wave to a photocurrent, which is proportional to the strain amplitude. So you are measuring the small photocurrent by all these techniques which you have put together. Now, when you ask the question, if I have an interferometer, does it have the same sensitivity at all frequencies? Then it turns out that because the noises are different at different frequencies, the sensitivity of the interferometer is different at different sensitivities. So what is shown here is the different frequencies and the sensitivity, the displacement it can measure at those different frequencies. So for example, if you ask at high frequencies, that means frequencies in this particular range, how do you get this sensitivity? You have to use high power lasers. The power recycling helps quite a lot. If you want to achieve this sensitivity, you really have to control the thermal noise. So you really have to build mirrors which have lower thermal noise. And then the most challenging thing is that what happens when you go to lower frequencies. Now it looks like I'm standing on a very stable Earth, but this Earth underneath my feet is moving quite a lot. It moves almost 1 nanometer. And I'm trying to measure 1,000th of a Fermi. So obviously, my interferometer is being pushed around a lot. So the only way you can manage this is by having better vibration as isolation. You build, in the car, you have the shock absorbers. So you do exactly something like that. You put, you try to isolate the interferometer by using passive oscillators and active isolation. And you can reduce the displacement by factors of 10 raised to 10. And putting all these things together, essentially, you really push instrument science to the frontiers. And what you really need to achieve are limits which are at the limits of what you can do by physics today. So you can see here that it is the requirement to do all this. And it's not only about general theory of relativity. It involves lasers, coatings, materials, vibration isolation, mechanism. So everything has to come into place. And all this technology is available only today. It was not available 100 years before. Even after putting all these things together, the LIGO guys realized that they were fighting for something which was much more complicated. So they felt that they should be more careful. They should try to make sure that when they say they have seen an astrophysical signal, they can be very sure about it. So what they decided was that they would believe that they are seeing something astrophysical only if they saw it in 2 detectors put as far away in the US as possible. So they built one interferometer in Hanford, one at Livingston, identical 4-kilometer long interferometers. And for the rest of my story, sometimes it will be very important. They were even more careful. At the Hanford site, in the same beam tube, they put 2 detectors. So they had 2 sites and 3 detectors. And at each site, you try to look at all possible other sources of noise so that after removing all of them, if something still remains, only then you will claim that you have seen an astrophysical signal. So you should see a signal in this LIGO and this LIGO. And since they are at different places, even if light travels at the speed of, if gravitational waves travel at the speed of light, they could come at slightly different times. So the light travel time is about 10 milliseconds between these 2 sites. So you should see a signal within the 10 milliseconds. Then you will see that it's an astrophysical signal. The Europeans built their own smaller detector, which is 3 kilometers, which is called the Virgo detector. And today, these are the 3 big detectors which look for gravitational waves. So it was an important point to emphasize that this instrument is the most sensitive instrument on the Earth because it can measure this very small displacement. And it was really put together by a set of very talented instrument builders who really worked on it almost all their lives. If you look at the people who work on this particular project, they started as PhD students, and when they began, they had hair on their head, but now most of them are bald. So you have a remarkable experiment, but even when you're trying to do something challenging, you never attempt it in the first go. You first build a first level instrument, which was what was built, which was called initial LIGO. It functioned from 1994 to 2010. It did not detect anything. And then once you can show that all the technology you are claiming can be implemented, you improve the sensitivity by improving the component. And remember that if you have an instrument which is 10 times more sensitive, it can see 10 times as far. So the volume it will scan is 1,000 times more. So if the sources are uniformly distributed, then you will see 1,000 times more sources. So that is exactly what the advanced LIGO was supposed to do, that when it reaches design sensitivity, it will be 10 times more accurate, more sensitive than the initial instrument. And as I explained to you, these interferometers are broadband detectors. That means if you cast the signal at some particular frequency, you can watch it for about 1,000 cycles, right? So if you see the signal at 20 hertz, you can see the signal till about 100, 1,000 hertz or 1 kilohertz. Whereas if you had a bar detector, which is narrow band, it is sensitive at a very small bandwidth. Let's say a few hertz, around a kilohertz or something like that. And this, as you will see, when I come to the sources, they are very important because the sources we are looking for are not supernova remnants, but coalescing compact binaries. So these binaries are going inwards. So they are inspiraling. They're putting out gravitational radiation. So once they enter the sensitivity band of the detector, till it reaches the exit point, you are seeing more and more cycles. So even though in one cycle the signal is very weak, by building thousands of cycles, you can improve the signal to noise ratio. And that plays a very important role in the detection, as you will see next. So now I have told you something about the instrument, but the story does not get over because of the fact that even after doing all this, compared to the noise of the detector, the signal is very, very weak. So we are in a situation where we have weak signals buried in the large noise of the detector. So if you want to detect it, if you really look at the output port of the detector, you won't see any particular signal. So you use an engineering technique which is called match filtering, both to detect that signal, extract the parameters of this particular signal, or characterize that particular signal. What is match filtering? Match filtering is a very simple process. You take the known signal which comes out of the detector, the noisy data which comes out of the detector, and multiply it by the known signal. What is meant by known? I told you that this system is an inspirling signal. So I know that its frequency should increase with respect to time, its amplitude should increase with respect to time. It should be what we call as a chirp signal. So what is shown here is in red the noisy data, and in that noisy data is a known signal which is sort of sitting here. Now, if you do the correlation, what you will see is the following. So you can see here, you are away here, you don't see anything. But when you reach this particular point, the correlation is basically picked up. Now the correlation is basically picked up because I have matched this buried thing, the parameters here, and the parameters of what I have used has matched exactly. So this is exactly what is called match filtering. So if you know what you are looking for, that is, if you want to succeed by using match filtering, you really need to have an accurate model of the signal, and this is where general relativity really plays a very important role. If you cannot match the phase information very accurately, the correlation will not be very strong. So capturing the phase information as accurately as possible is the key to detecting gravitational waves. And this is where the second player comes into the game, and this is Kip Thorne. When the project was sort of funded in 1993, he got together a team of 30, 40 people to look at what the signal will look like, and they wrote a very famous physical review letter paper which was called The Last 3 Minutes, Issues in the Gravitational Wave Measurements of Coalescing Compact Binaries. Now, as I told you, this is the phase where they are inspiraling, and then, as I said, they will coalesce. At that particular point, you really don't know. All the nonlinearities of general relativity come into play, so you really don't know what this waveform will look like. And then, once it has sort of merged, it's like a bell being hit. And once a bell is being hit, if you hear the sound, and then you see this sound dying away. This is something which is called as the ring down or the quasi-normal modes of this particular black hole. So therefore, this is something which you can try to do analytically. This requires supercomputer calculations, and Kip Thorne basically realized that you really will need to do numerical simulations if you want to succeed to detect gravitational waves. On the other hand, my colleagues Luc Blanchet and Thibaut Damon had already started working, had a formalism by which you could use general theory of relativity to calculate this particular waveform. So what we started doing immediately after the project was funded was try to calculate as accurately as possible what the waveform would look like if two neutron stars or two black holes are going around each other. Now, the first term, if you look at this particular term, the first term is the leading term which is given by the quadrupole formula. This is the formula which Hulse and Taylor verified and got the Nobel Prize for. But then, as I told you, once the system starts coalescing and coming closer and closer to each other, its speed will start increasing. It will come in a region where the gravitational field is very strong. So the leading order term is not sufficient. You would really need to put the next order correction, v square by c square, v4 by c4, v6 by c6, etc. So what we really started doing was starting from 1993, etc. We really started doing this particular computation, and therefore by using this formalism which we sort of developed, we could calculate the phase to accuracy which are V7 by C7. And how was this possible? You basically use the general theory of relativity, and just as we do field theory calculations, lamp shift calculations, etc., the analogous thing is done by using general theory of relativity, and therefore now we have a formula which is very, very accurate, and that is the starting point for doing data analysis. So then, using this formula which I sort of showed you, Damour and Buonanno essentially showed that we don't have to worry about what happens at the interface, because it turns out that when you really generalize this analytical formula which I showed you to include what happens at the merger, the time scale here is so fast that it smoothly goes from this in spiral to merger and then goes down to this ring down. So analytical work essentially predicted that this is a very smooth transition, and later on numerical relativity verified that this is indeed true. So you can see here, Kip Thorne's worry that this will be a very complicated phase was not really true, and therefore we really are in a situation where, starting from the work which I mentioned in which we were involved, you can push it ahead and finally construct template families in which, for example, you can use to analyze the data coming from LIGO. And in this work, my colleague Ajit was one of them. He created the waveform by using another trick which is called as the phenomenological waveform. These two people use what we call as the effective one-body approach, and putting all these things together, we have a very good idea of what the source looks like. It's like saying that if you are looking for a needle, if you know how the needle looks like, then you can find it. That's exactly what the whole principle somehow is. So we have a very complicated object in the universe, a binary black hole, but its waveform is very, very predictable by using general theory of relativity. There is a ring spiral, there is a merger, and there is a ring down. And this ring down was predicted in 1969 by one of our physicists, Vishweshwara, who basically said that if you have a black hole and it settles down, it will settle down by, like a bell, by emitting quasi-normal modes. And as I explained to you, these calculations, are very complicated. It almost takes 10 to 20 years to really finish this particular calculation, basically because of the fact that we are dealing with a nonlinear system. So the equations are very, very complicated, and therefore it takes, you have to take into account all possible effects. Only then you can really get to this particular waveform. But we have something. We have an analytical formula which will describe this waveform completely. That is the important point you have to keep in mind. Now, what would happen if instead of a black hole, there are two neutron stars going around each other? That is the next question you will ask. And then physically you can argue that black holes are very, very strongly gravitating, but neutron stars are not so strongly gravitating. So when they start approaching each other, one neutron star will start tidally affecting the other. So you should see deviations from this point particle approximation, and that is exactly what happens. That if you have a neutron star, in the beginning it looks like a black hole waveform, but once the tidal interactions become operational, it will start deviating from. Now, what effect? How much is the tidal effect? Now, that will depend on the matter inside the neutron star, or what is called as the equation of state of the neutron star. So the tidal deformation is a function of the equation of state of neutron stars. So if you study a binary neutron star, if you can put a limit on how much is the tidal distortion, you can say something about nuclear physics. So this is the real excitement which really basically happened. So you are in a situation from 1990s where the experiment was really driving the theory. You have an exquisite theory, which is the general theory of relativity. You can apply it to coalescing binaries of black holes and neutron stars. And using them, you can build a sophisticated data analysis infrastructure. Today we have good quality computing, and therefore using all this, you can detect the gravitational waves, estimate the parameters of the source, test gravity, and for doing all this, you have to build template banks, use methods which are used by high energy physics people, which are Bayesian methods. So all this is available today from different disciplines, and all this play a very important role in making this particular discovery. So now we can ask this particular question, all this is happening abroad. what was happening in India. So in India, from 1990 to 2009, there were two significant fronts on which the action was happening. One, as I explained to you, was the work on source modeling at RRI in my group in collaboration with my French collaborators. And the other, work on gravitational wave data analysis at IUCAA under my illustrious colleague Sanjeev Dhurandhar. So I create the waveform, he uses it to build the template banks and then look for gravitational waves. And then there were students and postdocs in our groups. They had, after they finished, they went to postdoc positions in many active gravitational wave groups abroad. And somewhere around 2009 onward, by that time, many of them were back into faculty positions in India. We are very fortunate. So therefore, we basically realized that why should we only be involved in source modeling and gravity wave data analysis? We should also participate in the experiment. So basically, our idea was we should extend the Indian footprint in gravity from in these two areas to gravity wave experiments and help the community to build a global gravitational wave network. So this was our idea in 2009. But as you can see here, to have that confidence to do it really took us almost 20 years. And therefore, at the retreat in 2009, IUCAA at 20, in 2009, we formed the Indigo Consortium. And because we had the Indigo Consortium in place, in 2011, we could make the LIGO India proposal. What was the LIGO India proposal? I told you that there are two LIGO sites, but there are three detectors because in one beam tube, there were two detectors. Now, when the initial LIGO functioned very well, the Americans realized that you could do better science if you moved the second detector as far away from US as possible. And therefore, they wanted to move it to the furthest point on Earth, which is Australia. But somehow the Australians couldn't find the project proposal to host that particular detector. And therefore, since we were involved in that discussion, we were offered the detector to collaborate on LIGO India. So that is essentially how LIGO India basically happened, that the third LIGO detector will be given as a collaboration by the US, but we have to build all that infrastructure, the vacuum tube, the team, the sites, all that has to be our own work. So this is essentially the LIGO. Now, why is the global community interested in LIGO India? The most important thing is many things will improve, but the crucial thing is that if you have a detector which is far away, then the ability to localize sources on the sky improve on an average by 4 times and in some directions by a factor of 10 or 20. Instead of saying it in words, let's look at a figure. If you had the three LIGO detectors in the same, two LIGO detectors in the same beam tube, the other detector and the Virgo detector, you can localize sources in the sky in these regions very well, but not in this region. If you move one of the LIGO detectors to India, you can see that the sky localization improves very well. So it is interesting not just to us, but to everybody who's interested in gravitational wave data analysis. This was a bonus, and that is the reason the international community wanted to have LIGO India as a collaborative project. I really want to emphasize that the reason why even somebody like me who works in general relativity, who's interested in astronomy, was interested in LIGO India, was not just because it has interface with theoretical physics, astronomy, and so on. It really has got to do with the fact that the experiment is a very, very challenging experiment. It involves technology which is at the forefront. Technology is on various fronts. For example, as I told you, it involves precision measurements, fundamental tests. You are measuring things at the quantum level. Laser physics is at the forefront. You need to evacuate and have ultra-high vacuum in a very large volume. So vacuum technology, optical engineering, sensors which you use are again state-of-the-art. There are more than, many, many channels. So you have multiple control systems at play. So you can see here that the technological interface is very, very large. And therefore, if we have a facility like this, as we get familiar with this, it is going to have an impact not only on gravitational wave astronomy, but on rest of fundamental physics experiments which happen in the country. It is this which excites me. Now we come to the first detection of gravitational waves. As I said, we built the advanced LIGO detector. And then we started our first science run on September 12. And this run was supposed to happen for about 4 months. Now, whatever I'm going to say after this is the work of a very large collaboration, which is called the LIGO Scientific Collaboration and the Virgo Collaboration. And the person who was instrumental in putting this together was Barry Barish. Now, before he came around, LIGO was supposed to be a simple collaboration between MIT and Caltech, probably involving about 100 physicists. He came and suddenly, he had a high energy physics background. He suddenly realized that this effort involved could not be achieved if you had a very small group. It needed all the structure which is done in high energy physics. And therefore, he basically put together a collaboration of multiple institutions having about 1,000 to 1,500 people. And this was really the work of Barry Barish. So, just a couple of days after the detectors were turned on, the two LIGO observatories at Hanford and Livingston, we claimed that they detected a coincident gravitational wave signal. And remember, I told you the signal should arrive within the light travel time. So the signal indeed arrived at within 7 milliseconds, and it had a very high signal to noise ratio. So what is shown in the next slide is the signal which we saw amps up, and it has the same pattern of ramping up once you slide it by 7 milliseconds in the other detector. So this is what we mean by saying that the twin LIGOs detected a coincident gravitational wave signal. If the audio was heard, because this frequency are in the audio frequency, you would have heard a chirp, in the audio band. So, as I said, we have the observed data, and if we slide it, if they are coming from the same source, they should match as much as possible, except for the fact that the detectors are not identical. So there will be slight differences. So that's what is shown here. This is the observed data. Then I told you that we can reconstruct the parameters of the signal. So by using numerical relativity, we can reconstruct what the expected signals are for this kind of system. So that is what is called as the expected signals. And when you subtract one from the other, what remains is residuals which are consistent with the noise. So the important point is that we are claiming that what we are seeing is a binary system of two black holes. And then you can ask the question, how many times random noise can reproduce something like this? So what we basically could show, you can ask me a question of how we do this a little later, that once in 203,000 years, random noise can reproduce a signal with this signal to noise ratio. So you can see here that all our noise events have died away here, and this signal stands out way above it. And only once in 203,000 years, a random signal can reproduce something like this. So we say the significance of our event is 5.1 sigma. So not only have you to detect something, you have to say how confidently it is a signal which you are claiming it is. And then, as I said, you could determine its masses by using parameter estimation. You know the mass of the first black hole, second black hole. And if you add them together, you realize that the final black hole is 3 solar masses less. So in this very short time scale, gravitational waves are transferred, 3 solar mass worth of matter is getting converted to gravitational waves. So that is what it is. We can determine the black hole spin, then we can see how far it is. So remember, the signal is characterized by all these parameters. So we have to do a multi-parameter Bayesian analysis. So all these numbers are what we call 90% confidence limits. So in this first discovery, it was not just about detection of gravitational waves, as I will mention. It was the first direct detection of gravitational waves, the first detection of a binary black hole that merges within the age of the universe. People had seen binary neutron stars. People had conjectured that binary black holes should exist. But nobody had seen a binary black hole before, exactly. So, and we are seeing it in its final stages. So that is the reason I'm saying that we are seeing a binary black hole which merges within the age of the universe. When you look at the masses, we basically see that nobody had seen such heavy binary black holes before. So for the first time, we are seeing stellar mass black holes whose masses are more than 25 solar masses. X-ray observations always gave us masses much less compared to this. Now, once you know the mass is a particular value, you can ask, in what astrophysical environment can you make such objects? Now, it turns out that if you have a high metallicity in the medium, in the environment, then there are high winds and therefore you cannot build such. So immediately it tells you that if you want to build objects of these masses, you should have an environment where metallicity is very, very low. And the other thing which I told you is, because we can, the waveform which we are predicting comes from general theory of relativity, we can test general theory of relativity in this regime where gravity is very strong and the particles are moving at the black holes are moving at very, very high velocity. So you can see here that it is not just about the first detection of gravitational waves. What has been done would not be possible by conventional astronomy. And therefore, it is not an exaggeration to say that we are all very lucky, because February 11, 2016, when this announcement was really made, was exactly like the November 7, 1919, when Einstein's light deflection experiment really made headlines on all the newspapers on the earth. If you look at the newspapers corresponding to this particular day, headlines were not about BJP forming a government or anything like that. It was about two black holes merging in the age of the universe. So obviously Einstein should be very happy that 100 years after general relativity, he is still right, and the first detection of gravitational waves was really made.
As you said, the space is not calm. Space is in our space. There are so many accidents are happening, like what we have in our roads. Okay, then is there any chance of when you said two black holes are collapsed or merged together, then is there any chance of tsunami-like waves, gravitational waves happen? Is there any like that we can think?
Yes. So the key point is, as I said, the effect when you try, even if you take a black hole event, the strain it induces on the Earth is such a minute one that even though I am being buffeted by a lot of gravitational waves, I look the same. I'm not ideally distorted. It is the smallness of the fact of the strain when it reaches the Earth. Therefore, its effect on such effects will not really happen.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there any more better way for detecting gravitational waves other than interferometry?
Somebody like you has to come up with an idea. So it's a good question. The point is, as I said, there are two things. One thing is people are talking about using atom interferometers to detect gravitational waves. You can see that these are very, very big detectors. So can you build a lab type small detector by which you can detect gravitational waves? So nowadays, for example, people working in cold atoms are basically trying to say, maybe we can try to detect gravitational waves by using atom interferometry. The point is the biggest challenge is the following. As I told you, even when you build a sensitive instrument, it almost took 30 to 40 years to understand all the other sources of noise which will affect your instrument. So you may build a very sensitive atom interferometer, but what are the sources of noise which will affect your instrument? That somebody like you has to study. And after, like ray-wise, you make a list of all those, estimate of all those noises, you will be able to say whether atom interferometry will be able to detect gravitational waves. If you do that, you get a Nobel Prize.
So why do we limit our observations to just star systems? Why not galaxies as a whole? Can galaxies themselves emit gravitational waves?
Very good question. So the point is that, as I explained to you, these kinds of sources which I talked about today, binary black holes, binary neutron stars, whose masses are in the stellar mass range, their frequencies lie exactly in the frequency band where you can build detectors. When the mass becomes larger, then the frequencies become in the millihertz range. And therefore, you cannot detect them by looking at the detectors on the Earth. The LISA detector will essentially look for water. If you have two supermassive black holes going around each other, the frequency comes out in the millihertz range, and the LISA will be able to actually say something about the gravitational waves coming from those kinds of sources. But they are usually not the full galaxies themselves. In these galaxies, there are supermassive black holes which are 10⁵, 10⁶ solar masses. So it's almost like the mass is really concentrated there. So if the two, so it is not really the exact question which you're asking, two galaxies colliding, but very massive objects in these galaxies coalescing, their gravitational waves will be seen by LISA. And once LISA flies in 2036 or 2034, an answer to this particular question will come.
And so also, is there any way in which we could extract properties of potentially a particle for gravity from gravitational waves?
Not from these kinds of observations. So it's an important question which people keep asking. The gravitational, whatever we see here, the properties of gravity is at the classical level. We are not exploring the properties of gravitational gravity at the quantum level. So such things are definitely at play when you look at the gravitational wave detectors. I'm not an expert on it, but whether the gravitational wave detectors will say something about the quantum nature of gravity, the answer is no, directly. But as I told you, we are trying to test the theory, general theory of relativity. So suppose it turns out that when we try to test the general theory of relativity, we see some deviations from Einstein's theory. Then it is giving us a clue that maybe in addition to Einstein's theory, there is some additional component of gravity. Then that will give us a clue that maybe there are more generalized theory of gravity which we have to worry about. And then that may give us some clue to what is the extension of GR we have to look at, which will be consistent with observation. But all this will be, let's say, next 10 or 20 years when more and more observations come about. Now, as I said, the gravitational waves are really coming from a very large distance. They were emitted 1.3 billion years ago when light was really, for example, if you ask what is happening on the Earth, forget about human life being there or anything like that. What was really happening on the Earth was that a single cell was transforming to multicellular forms of life. So something which happened when the possibility of us probably didn't exist, we are able to sort of say very confidently. And therefore, this discovery paper, which had about 35 authors from Indian institutions and citations, as you will see, to important papers by Indian researchers. And this is the group of 35 which appear on that particular paper. For us, it was very important because we were waiting for the LIGO India approval, but just a week after the first discovery was announced, our LIGO India project was really approved. So you can see here that something which happened 1.3 billion years ago can affect your life today. It's not astrology, by the way. And therefore, if you ask, when is LIGO India supposed to come? LIGO India is supposed to come online by 2025. So LIGO, I have already told you about LIGO India. It's an Indo-US collaboration. So let me just go ahead. So for this discovery, in which I have already told you the main parts played by Ray Weiss, Kip Thorne, and Barry Barish, the 2017 Nobel Prize was given to all these people, these three people, for decisive contributions to the LIGO detector and the observation of gravitational waves. The second observation run started in November 30th, and by then Virgo was ready and it joined the observation. So instead of having just two detectors, there's a detector in Europe which is looking for gravitational waves. And just a week after that, again, all the three detectors detected a binary black hole. And then you can see whatever I was telling you, when only two detectors were functional, the sky localization was over 1,000 square degrees. Because there is a third detector, you could localize the source into 60 square degrees. So if you want to follow up this by astronomical observation, it is much more possible now. And that is really what the gravitational wave network really begins. And this had a very important role to play for what I'm going to say next, because what happened after the discovery of this, after the neutron, after the black hole discovery, was something which we were waiting for. And this is what I call the spectacular launch of multi-messenger astronomy. This was announced on October 16, 2017. What was announced was that we made the first discovery of gravitational waves, not from a binary black hole, but from a binary neutron star in spiral. So as I told you that a neutron star in spiral, it will be a signal which will be seen over a full bandwidth. So if you look at 23 hertz to about 2000 hertz, you have about 4,200 cycles. So even though one event has a very small signal to noise ratio, because you can use the signal, track the signal for about 100 seconds, you can see the signal very, very accurately. And the formula which I showed you is essentially what describes this particular signal. Not only that, so I'll come to the next part. We have seen a gravitational wave signal, but then something remarkable happened with our colleagues who do gravitational wave observations by using gamma rays. So you can see here, we have seen the gravitational wave signal, and just 1.7 milliseconds after that, there is a signal seen by the Fermi Observatory. It's a gamma ray signal. Now you ask the question, if something comes so close, are they really coming from the same event? Or it's an accident? But remember, it could be an accident, right? Just because of the fact that they come so close in time, it does not mean they are coming from the same event. So you see a signal in gravitational wave, you see a gamma ray signal, and then you basically go and ask the question, if I tell my astronomic friends, please see whether there is other radiations coming from this particular region in the sky, I should basically be able to tell them where in the sky they should look at. When only 2 detectors were there, the sky localization was very large. But the moment we had the Virgo detectors, the sky localization has become much more smaller. So we could tell our astronomy friends, please point your telescope to this region in the sky and see whether you see any particular radiation. This was done, and immediately afterwards, in 10 hours, the SWOPE telescope in Chile spotted an optical counterpart exactly in that same region in the sky. So gravitational waves, then we see the gamma ray signal, and the optical people see some signal there. And once they see something, 5 other observatories also confirm that from that same region in the sky, they are seeing radiation. And this is exactly the different instruments which are seeing that particular signal. So this was an event which was observed by 70 observatories, more than 100 instruments, and Indian instruments like AstroSat, GMRT, Himalayan Chandra Telescope followed up this particular event. And therefore, you saw this event not only in gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet, optical, infrared, radio, and the different radiations come at different time scales. For example, the X-ray came after 9 days, the radio came after 16 days, etc. So obviously it means there are linked processes, but they are not necessarily the identical processes which happen. And therefore, in 2017, a paper was put together where it is not just the LIGO and Virgo collaborations, all the collaborations participated. So this collaboration, this paper essentially has 3,500 authors, 950 institutes, 48 follow-up groups, 70 observatories, and 100 instruments. So you can see that for the first time, an event has been really followed with so much intensity. So I like to sort of compare it with, those of you who have seen Charlie Chaplin movies, right? It's the movies of the silent era. And then we had talkies, right? So the black hole was like the transition from silent movie to talkies. But the gravity wave from the neutron star is like seeing the whole universe in IMAX, because you can see it in all possible frequencies. And again, now I'll just rapidly go through it. Once you know that there's a gravity wave source, you can reconstruct its parameters, and you can do something which I told you, right? If you can determine the tidal parameters, you can say what is the equation of state which is consistent with these particular observations. Even that was possible, and it was done by the collaboration. So many first observation of gravitational waves from a neutron star system, first observation of gravitational waves and electromagnetic waves from the same source, and therefore it supports the hypothesis that this object was produced by the merger of 2 neutron stars in a particular galaxy. It was followed by a gamma ray burst. Then there was this phenomena which are called kilonova. And this kilonova is really powered by radioactive decay of our processes, and many of these nuclei are synthesized by this ejector. It's very interesting that though things like gold and platinum have been used by humans for many, many years, even till today, we are not sure how they are made in the universe. People had speculated that maybe supernovas make these heavy elements. Remember, iron is the most stable. So how do you make elements beyond iron? That was the basic question. So when people try to study the supernova, the rates of supernova, the physics of supernova, is not enough to create these particular elements. But if you have two neutron stars going with each other, you have a very large flux of neutrons. And therefore, our process can basically happen. And therefore, essentially, in such a process, you can make 150 Earth mass of silver, 100 Earth mass of gold, 500 Earth mass of platinum, etc. And therefore, in trying to understand this particular experiment or this particular observation, more than 700 papers have been written over the last 2-3 years. So you can see that what we have really seen is that people are still trying to look in this region in the sky. For example, even in 2019, 2018, there are radio observations. Superluminal motion has been detected. So the jet has been identified. Strontium, which is a signal of a neutron capture element, has been identified. And some Hubble Space Telescope, HST observation really has also sort of told us that our process is really happening. So even as late as this month, papers are coming about what is really happening with this particular source. So you can basically see that this particular area has really opened up. A new astronomy really is basically happening. We can also do cosmology because, as I told you, by using gravitational wave observations, you can measure its distance. By using optical observations, you can measure its redshift. And by putting both these things together, you can measure the Hubble constant. So not only you can do gravitational wave physics, you can also do astrophysics, and you can do cosmology. And the important point is you can test many fundamental predictions of gravity by using this particular thing. So I really won't go over all of this. I'll only sort of emphasize that when LIGO the name was coined, it's an acronym, as you know, for Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. The astronomers laughed at us. They said, you have not even detected gravitational waves and you are calling your facility an observatory. You agree that this O, which we had to fight for, has been earned twice over when we made the first discovery, because we have found black holes which could not be seen before. We have seen short gamma ray burst, which was being sort of predicted by the models for short gamma ray burst, which was conjectured by astronomers but never proved. So in a sense, even with our first discovery, we have transformed the field and a new astronomy really has come into being. 10 black holes have been sort of discovered, 1 neutron stars have been discovered, and colleagues outside the group, in addition, have been able to discover 8 more black holes by using other data analysis techniques. So basically, what I want to sort of say is the fact that after these two things, we today are in what we call as the third era, open public alert era for gravitational wave detection. This began on 1st April. And what we do now is, the moment we suspect something, we tell our astronomer friends. We don't wait to confirm whether it's a gravity wave signal. Remember, when we detect something, it could be just a instrumental noise. So we do some preliminary tests to make sure that it is probably a candidate, and then immediately tell our astronomy friends so that they can try to see whether there is radiation from that region in the sky. So that is the reason we call it open public alerts. And in this open public alerts, we have already sent out 46 alerts. We have retracted 11 of them. And if you try to make preliminary analysis, essentially we have seen 4 more binary neutron stars, 4 neutron star black holes, 23 black hole detections. Remember, these are candidates. Some of them may go away. But the important point is, as the detector becomes more sensitive, it can see more regions in the sky. So you will see more and more events. And that's exactly what we are seeing. So what is required if you want to do open public alerts? You have to sort of be able to send something, do this in less than a minute. The moment we see something, within 1 minute, we have to do some analysis and in low latency try to say that probably there is a candidate. Then we do some more analysis for about an hour. And by this time, we decide whether it is instrumental. That means whether we should retract or whether we should go ahead. And then, of course, there is the hard work of classifying this particular source, which sometimes takes months to do this. And then as we update our information, we send update alerts. So you can see here that we are already doing astronomy and working with the astronomers. So our claim on that O definitely is justified. Now, what is the status of LIGO India? The land for LIGO India has been completely acquired. Now, some civil work will start, and eventually, as I told you, in 2025, LIGO India will really be taking radiation, will be taking scientific reading. So and this is where, I just want to spend a couple of minutes. As I told you in the beginning, there was a LIGO India proposal, but some of us were already working with LIGO data. That was what was called as Indigo LIGO Scientific Collaboration. Now that LIGO India land has been acquired and it's a project, we wanted to merge both these things together. So we have created what we call as the LIGO India Scientific Collaboration. Essentially, in the beginning, from 2000 to 2010, Sanjeev Dhurandhar was the only group which worked in the LIGO Scientific Collaboration. Today, there are 13 institutions which participate, and there are about 100 people who participate in the LIGO India Scientific Collaboration. And why is LIGO India important? If LIGO India was functioning, the sky localization would not be over 30 square degrees, but over 11 square degrees. And then you can imagine that we can locate things even better, so you can see that event even earlier. And that is really the reason why everybody is excited. Will this end gravitational waves? The answer is no. After we finish O3, we will go to O4. Already a detector is coming online in Japan, which is called the Kagra detector. It will join now by the end of December into all the observations. So after the December, in 2020, the analysis will be of data taken by LIGO, Virgo, and Kagra. And as I said, these detectors are not similarly sensitive. The LIGO detectors are more sensitive, and therefore they can see further. Virgo's is the next one, and the Kagra will eventually work to that particular sensitivity. So by 2025, we expect a global network, including LIGO India, and we really are just beginning our exploration. The detectors will be upgraded by further factors of 2 or 3 to become what I call enhanced LIGO, Voyager, and then eventually 10 times more sensitive detectors called the Einstein telescope or the cosmic explorer, and so on. And eventually a detector which is being funded in space, which is called LISA. What is the science we expect to derive from all this exploration? We'll be able to study gravity in its extreme strength, matter in its extreme form, and eventually say something about cosmology or say something about cosmic history. So it touches everything which you can imagine: fundamental physics, astronomy, and cosmology. If you ask for where astronomy started, it started with Galileo. Galileo pointed a telescope to the heavens and we had optical astronomy. For many, many years, that was the only thing possible. But then, after the Second World War, radio astronomy came into being, and then it changed our picture of the universe. Instead of being a quiet universe, it became a violent universe. And then, by putting spacecraft, people started doing X-ray astronomy or gamma ray astronomy, and therefore we have electromagnetic astronomy over 2 decades of frequency. Similarly, gravitational waves would also span 2 decades of frequency, because the LIGO is sensitive at high frequencies. The space detector will be in the millihertz range. Then in the nanohertz range, it will be the pulsar timing arrays. And maybe there are gravitational waves emitted by the Big Bang. So that will really be the Big Bang observatory, which will be probably 30 to 40 years from now. So just as we have multiple bands for electromagnetic astronomy, we have multiple bands for gravitational wave astronomy, and we are just scratching the surface when we are making observations here. And the kind of sources we will have are different kinds of sources. We have predicted some things, so I call them known knowns, known unknowns. We know something should exist, but eventually we hope that there is some unknown unknown which we will be able to discover. So to conclude, with advanced LIGO, we achieved the technology to make a direct detection of gravitational waves 100 years after Einstein predicted them. We also have corresponding progress in the two-body problem in general relativity and related data analysis to detect gravitational waves, characterize them, and begin to test general relativity in the dynamic strong field regime. The Nobel Prize was given in 2017 exactly for this. The important point is the binary neutron star case ushered in a new astronomy, and the game changer was the fact that we have a network of detectors, and when we have a big network, you can localize sources in the sky and follow them up by electromagnetic observation. And you will agree that it is not just the first discovery of gravitational waves from black holes and binary neutron stars. We have found insight into astrophysics, cosmology, and fundamental physics. We assessed that they were feasible, but who would have guessed that at the first detection itself, so many things would have been possible? So I would basically want to point out that this is an area where quite a few people who have done their undergraduate or graduate from this particular state have participated in the LIGO scientific collaboration. So you can definitely see that there is a lot of scope in this particular activity. How to do it, you can ask me, and then I will come back to that. So my final thing is, please come and decipher the gravitational wave observations and multi-messenger astronomy, because there are many, many of these things to be sort of discovered. It is just the beginning, and therefore even though I may not be around, you would definitely be around to see many of these discoveries.
You were telling about the observations of gravitational waves from binary systems. Is there any possibilities for observation from other systems?
Very good question. Thank you. So the point is, we keep talking about binary systems basically because of the fact that they are the strongest emitters of gravitational waves. So the whole question, as I told you, is if I take a binary system of black holes or neutron stars, the strain that they cause on a detector on the Earth typically is of the order of, as I said, 1,000th of a Fermi. If you take, for example, a neutron star, and suppose the neutron star has a small mountain or a small dimple on it, then it has a small quadrupole moment. And if you ask how much this quadrupole moment gravitational wave will be produced, the strain comes out to be a very small number. So we do look for gravitational waves from other sources. Though I emphasized only about coalescing compact binaries, we look for gravitational waves from supernova. We look for gravitational waves from isolated neutron stars which are rotating. We look for gravitational waves which are a stochastic background. Because you may not be able to see a single, but many of these things going like popcorn will act together, and there may be a background of astrophysical gravitational wave sources. Or gravitational waves may be emitted by the Big Bang. These are called stochastic gravitational waves. So we really search for all these four types of gravitational waves. I talked only about this because this is where we have succeeded. Anytime we succeed in the other one, that will also be talked about. But at this particular point, we can only put limits on them and not a firm detection number. But it's a good question that there are other sources of gravitational waves.
I just had, in connection to that, had we been able to detect gravitational waves in the time when the Shoemaker-Levy comet was merged in the
So
Jupiter?
again, as I said, you get basically killed by two things. One thing is the mass of the object and the compactness of this object. It is the reason why we are doing so well with black holes and neutron stars is that they are massive. If we have black holes, they can be very massive. And because they are compact, they can come very, very close. If you take ordinary matter, ordinary stars, etc., the radii is a few thousands or 10,000s of kilometers. So by the time they start coming closer, they'll tidally disrupt or they will touch. So they'll not reach those frequencies where our detectors are sensitive. So that is the killer.
You have shown that 1 minute is the alert. 1 minute is the alert setup. Is it automatically set up in an analysis?
Yeah, so there are pipelines which are sort of set up. It's not the 1 minute thing is, there is some part which is done automatically, but even now we are not completely automatable. So there is a human vetting. Okay. See, what really happens is that, what I am telling you is the cleanest part of it. But before doing that, the detector noises collected over, noises from 300, 400 channels. You really have to make sure that what you are seeing is not correlated to any signal in those things. So some of those things are sort of automated. But after that 1 minute, so the match field, the template construction, etc., some of them, all that is sort of automated. But after that 1 minute, that 1 hour thing. There is a human team which basically looks at the correlation. So we still have not been able to automate it. Eventually, probably by the time it goes through design sensitivity, we'll try to automate most of it. But even now, we are far from that.
I have one more question. Let's say, so these masses of black holes,
Correct.
what you get from the analysis,
Correct.
is it other probes also provide the same answer or not?
So the way you do it, as you rightly said, it comes from the data analysis. You get these particular masses. So then what you do is you go to an astrophysics friend who do stellar evolution and then ask them, do your stellar evolution codes with certain amount of astrophysics things produce these kinds of objects. So that is, and there is a lot of uncertainty because depending on the inputs which go into those astrophysical codes, so therefore of the 30 or 40 different models, a subset of those models will be picked up consistent with these particular observations. Not every one of the scenarios which they come up with will be consistent with the masses we produce. So it tells us something about this formation channel.
So, will such experiments give any indication of the existence of life in any other parts of the universe?
It's more difficult. Yeah, no. As of now, no. It's very difficult to. But it's very interesting, for example, that eventually nobody would have, when you think about special relativity and general relativity, the effect which they had was sort of so small, nobody would have thought that in practical life they would ever be used. But today that anybody who has a smartphone essentially uses a GPS, and the GPS will not work if you take into account those corrections. So can gravitational waves be used for communication is a question which eventually will be asked. Right now, I have not seen any interesting answer to that. But it is very interesting that Dyson, the Freeman Dyson, who worked in quantum electrodynamics, he was one of the first persons who basically had said that the coalescing of two neutron stars may be the way you will propel spacecraft. Because he said that there's going to be so much energy coming out of it, you can use it to propel spacecraft. And this was before neutron stars were discovered, before neutron star binaries were discovered. So, and that paper appeared in some, interstellar communication journal. So, the fact that this energy can it be tapped to do something, or this way of this radiation can be used to communicate, as of now, it seems very difficult because of the fact that our ability, the gravitational interaction is very weak. So, to build a system where you can tap the gravitational feature to do something seems to be more challenging than with electromagnetic interaction. So as of now, I have not seen anything like that, but who knows 50 years from now what the story will be. The basic problem with this kind of area now is that it is no longer a quiet field. It's a very, very fast moving field. And therefore, it's very difficult to work in this particular field in isolation. You really have to get involved. You really have to get involved with people who are already actively participating in this particular exercise. We have decided is that, as I said, we do open public alerts. So now astronomers basically can follow up what we are seeing and try to see whether there is some interesting electromagnetic astronomy coming from it. So what this basically does every year is, what is it that we are going to do in that year? What is the kind of observations we are going to do? What is the kind of physics we will try, astrophysics, cosmology we will try to extract from that? We try to make a list of those things. And then we basically tell people that these are the interesting problems. If you really want to interact or work on these particular problems, please get in touch with those groups which work already in this particular problem. Because only through those groups you will get access to the data. Because till our analysis is done, you don't get access to this particular data, even though you have these public alerts. So what I would say is, the only way you can get involved in this is by being a graduate student or a postdoc in a group which already works in the LIGO scientific collaboration. And as I told you, for an audience here, the natural network is through IUCAA. Because IUCAA has a very big group, and the mandate of IUCAA is to grow the gravity wave community in the country. So I would say that if you are really interested in this particular area, if you are a master's student over the summer, try to go to one of these 13 institutes and try to do a summer project so that you get an idea of what is really involved in this particular area. That is a good beginning. So what has really happened is many students come, spend the summer, and then start working on a particular problem. And even though they go back, over the year, they work on it and eventually in some cases manage to finish a project and write a paper on some analysis possible. So once you spend the summer there, you can decide whether you like this particular area or you hate this particular area. So you can make up your mind at least. It does not matter which way. And then you basically have to get to a group where this work is being pursued and become a graduate student there. Or if you're already finishing your PhD, even though you have not worked on gravitational waves, if you have the right kind of skills, Python programming, some numerical expertise, data analysis, statistics experience, people switch. So this is an area where you really don't have to have worked on gravitational waves to join a gravity wave group. You really need to have some basic skills. So many of the people who work in LIGO, scientific collaboration, came from high energy physics because the data analysis techniques, Bayesian techniques, all are common to all these areas. So I would say that if you are serious, get engaged with somebody who is already working in this particular object. There's a lot of material which is available. For example, I come from ICTS. Every year ICTS runs a school on gravitational waves, and then we sort of archive it on our website. So even remotely, you can follow those particular lectures, build your background so that you are prepared when you go for your summer program. So I would say that anybody who has the technical preparation, you can start working by interacting with somebody who is already in this particular area. Without that, it is very, very difficult because it has become a very competitive area. Things have to be done, not only done, but have to be done very fast because 100 other people are trying to do the same thing. And the data is coming so fast, as we are talking about data, right, that it is becoming more and more difficult to keep up. The collaboration itself is not being able to analyze all the data, and we are obliged to make the data public after a certain time. So we are finding it very, very difficult. So there is always scope for more people to join the collaboration. I hope that helps.